Hey guys, so today I'm going to be showing you how to export stems from one DAW, in this case Logic, to pretty much any other DAW. We're basically exporting audio files, so those are pretty much universal regardless of which DAW program you might use later. So this can be really useful if you say have a separate mix engineer or just want stems for whatever reason. You want to have all of the tracks laid out pretty much exactly the way they sound in one project. And then that way different engineers in different studios can share files and work in their DAW of choice. All right, so it's actually pretty easy, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we have a complete, a fully done song. It's already been mixed and edited, but let's just say hypothetically that this was simply a tracking session, and maybe we've done a little bit of pre-mixing during our tracking session just to help us get a sense of what a mix engineer might do or what kind of things we need to worry about when we're tracking. It's very common, very normal to kind of mix a little bit as you go. So I'll show you how to basically undo all of the mixing that you've done, but only retain the edits, right? The placement of the timing of elements, as well as like volume and pan automations, any kind of editing, but not necessarily mixing. We want to export, we want to render all of our changes just as simple plain audio files that pretty much any other DAW could use as any other studio. So depending on what your destination is, there's a couple different options you want to be aware of. Okay, the first thing you want to do is go through the list here of your track names, because it's going to borrow these names for your tracks when it exports the stems. So you want to make sure you get rid of anything like this guy, right? This BIP, right? So Logic adds that whenever you bounce in place. So this synth here was a MIDI track, and then I rendered it down into audio, and then it added it there. So watch for that. The names of the regions don't really matter so much. It's going to rename them for us based on the track names. Okay, and so your stems are not going to have, like, say, a region for here and a region for here. Your mix engineer or wherever you send it off to is not going to have to worry about any of that stuff. They're going to get an individual stem for each one of these channels in the mix console, right? Like one of these, right? Each one of these is going to be rendered into its own unique audio file, and they will all be the same length. So all they have to do is pull them all into the beginning, and everything's already lined up, ready to go, and the mix engineer can do their thing, right? And mix and match as they please. Okay, so this is obviously a heavily mixed session already. Tons of effects, and we could go through and turn all this stuff off and then do our stems then, but Logic gives you a way to basically do it on the fly. You don't actually have to turn anything off. It will do that for us. Okay, so to export stems, it's Shift Command E. See, that brings up this dialog here. All right, so show you that again. You can go to File, Export, and say all tracks as audio files. So if you didn't want, say, these reference tracks here, right? These are just for reference during mix time. Okay, but your mix engineer might have their own references, or there might just be a track or a channel that you don't want to export a stem for. You can highlight what you do want. Use Command to unselect the ones you don't, just theoretically. Let's say we don't want these, and we want all these. Sure. Okay, then go to File, Export, and say 19 tracks as audio files, right? These are the 19 that we have selected. Okay, it doesn't look like 19 because some of these are collapsed in here, but yeah, it should be 19, right? If I uncheck that, or I only have one selected, then I go back up to Export, one track as audio file, right? So whatever you have selected, whether it's multiples or even just one, that's Command E to export that as its own audio file. But in this case, we want to do all tracks as audio files. I'm going to go ahead and include the reference, and it'd be easy enough to just get rid of it later. I think that's easier than selecting everything except the reference and getting rid of it then. Okay, so I already have a folder on my desktop that I've made for this. Okay, and you can basically export it wherever you want, but it's going to put them all together in the same directory. All right, now range, trim silence at file in, that's probably fine most of the time, but I want to just double check that everything is the same length. It doesn't matter so much about the ending as it does about the beginning, so it shouldn't really matter. But if you don't want to do the whole track, the whole song I mean, then set the location markers, the cycle range, the little yellow bar at the top. You can set the range of export that you want. I want it to start here and in here. Use the cycle markers for that, and then select export cycle range only. Okay, but in this case we want the whole song, every single stem I want to be the same length, so I would choose extend file length to project end. It would be helpful to know what file format they request or want, but they might not have a preference. Okay, so if you don't know or they don't care, then export in the file format that you recorded your session in. In this case, that would be AIF, which I think is the default for Logic. Okay, but hypothetically, let's say we're exporting to an engineer who's using Studio One, which is something that I use quite often. So if that was the case, if I was that engineer, I would request WAV files, which is the default for Studio One. Although it doesn't really matter because most DAWs can handle pretty much either of these file types. Okay, but just for consistency's sake, we'll stick with WAV. Now, definitely want to the bit depth. You want to leave that at whatever you've recorded it at. No higher, no lower. I can't imagine why you would want to go down. So don't change your sample rate. Don't change your bit depth. Use whatever you recorded it in. All right. If I had any in this session, this multi-output software instruments, if I had any, this wouldn't be grayed out. Right. So like in the case of the drummer track, there's the drums is one channel, one track in the arrange window, but in the mix console, it's several different tracks. One for the kick, one for the snare, the hi-hat, cymbals, toms. They all get a separate channel, so you could apply different effects and mix those individual pieces, but it's kind of treated as one instrument, the drums. Okay, so if you have anything like that, you can choose here what you want to do with each individual channel in the mixer. If you want to either sum them together and just say this is a stem of the drums, or if you want individual channels for each of the multi-output routes that it has. Right, so you'll have a separate stem for the kick, a separate stem for the snare. Most of the time, that's probably what you're going to want. If you send to a mix engineer, you want as much separation and control over how the final mix is going to be as you can possibly give them. Okay. If it's just for your own reference, or maybe you want to build a backtrack or something out of some of these stems later, then maybe you can save on the file type or save on some of the file size on your computer by just rendering multi-instruments as one instrument. Okay, bypass effects plugins. So again, if you're sending to a mix engineer, somebody who's going to be mixing this stuff, they're not going to want the same effects and stuff that you've already applied most of the time. If there's something that's really truly crucial, like I gotta have this delay, then maybe I would do a separate session or a separate stem export just for those tracks or channels that need that specific effect. But most of the time, your mix engineer is going to want to use the stuff that they know, the stuff they're comfortable with and familiar with. And so if you print these effects that you have here into your stems, they're basically there forever. They can't be undone. So if later it's like it's a really great sounding delay or whatever, or that EQ sounds good, it's just a bit much, there's nothing they can do about it. It's printed into that stem, into that waveform, and it's much better in the mixing stage to have as much control over the way things are going to sound in the end as you can possibly manage to maintain. Okay, so we're going to turn all that off, and that's going to basically undo all of these effects. If you want to retain all of the effects in, say you want to make backtracks for a live show later and you just want to take out some of the elements, so you need everything in separate stems, but you want it to sound as close to how you've mixed it in this session as you possibly can, then you would not bypass the effects. You'd want to render all those effects to the individual stems. And then include volume and pan automations. Again, if you're sending to a mix engineer, don't include volume and pan automations. If these are for like karaoke tracks or backtracks you've already mixed and you want to retain the mix effects, then you do want to include volume and pan automations. Normalization, 99% of the time, you're not going to want this. Normalization means bringing it up as loud as it can possibly be before clipping, and there's really no good reason for that. Overload protection means it will only turn it down if it's already past that threshold where it's clipping or distorting. It will turn it down and try to reduce the distortion or even eliminate it. But you either want off or overload protection only. I can't imagine a scenario where you would want this on. Okay? You're basically removing the headroom and undoing any kind of balancing or gain staging that you've done ahead of time. Add resulting files to project browser. Probably not. It's essentially just making duplicate copies of the files and taking up hard drive space and putting them in two places. We want to export to this directory that I've created here. And I can't imagine why I would want duplicates. If I did, I would just copy them from this directory. All right, so here is where you have the option to say you can drag these in and it will adjust. You can see it gives you an example here, right? So this song is called Interstellar Love Song. And then if I drag out the project name or just delete it, right? Probably just track name is probably fine, but maybe wherever you're sending it to might request something specific. And I think you could even put in like a space here if you, boom, right? So that might work. Project name and then a little space and then track name. That's very easy to read, or maybe even the other way around, right? Track name first and a little space and then, or even like a dash, however you want to do it, right? So you have some options based on what you want to type in here. It's the pattern that it's going to use to name each individual stem so that wherever you send them or later when you go to look at your stems, you can tell which stem goes to what. It isn't just number 1, number 2, number 3, but instead it will say something like mic test, or in the case here, lead vocals, lead guitar, acoustic guitar, bass, piano. It will name them based on the track names that we set here. That's why we go through ahead of time and we make sure that our track names make sense and don't have a bunch of garbly goop 001 underscore dash BIP. Get rid of all that stuff. Okay, do yourself a favor. All right, so I think we're about ready. We'll hit export. And this will probably take a little while depending on the size of your session and how many effects and stuff it has to render. So I'm going to let it do its thing and we'll come back in a second. Okay, so now that our export is done, let's see what it looks like to import into a different DAW. In this case, I'm going to be using Studio One, which these days is sort of my DAW of choice. So I will show you what that looks like. Okay, so here we are now in Studio One. Now this is kind of my DAW of choice these days, but I just wanted to show you real quick what it looks like when we import those stems that we previously exported from Logic, just to show you how nice and simple and easy this is. Okay, so here I have a built-in browser for Studio One, and you can see in our Interstellar Love Song stems folder are all of the stems that we've exported. Okay, so I, as the mix engineer, can just grab all of these. They're already named accordingly. Everything looks great, and we just drag them all into the beginning of the session. And it takes a second to do its little thing. Zoom out a bit, and we can see here's all of the files, right? And they're all the same length. Everything is lined up beautifully, ready to go. But it's entirely unmixed, right? So we have all of the edits, the fades in between regions, all of the cuts and the placement of time, all of the noise removal, basically all of the editing still intact, but none of the mixing. All right, so now I could theoretically go through and mix this stuff to my heart's content using the stuff that I'm comfortable with, that I know and love, all of my plugins in my DAW of choice, and do a great mix and be comfortable doing it, which is going to yield much better results in the end. All right, so that's it for exporting stems from Logic to send to another DAW or another engineer. Pretty simple most of the time. So just to recap, you're going to want to make sure that you know what your destination is and ask them what kind of file types they request, or if they don't care, then stick with the files, types, and settings that you have already done your session in, your tracking session in. Okay, undo any effects if this is going to be mixed later, and retain the effects if you want to do like karaoke tracks or backtracks, or mix and match different stems to come up with sort of different versions or an instrumental version or something of a song, but you want to retain those effects. Okay, so it's pretty simple, and I hope you found this helpful. All right, guys, thanks. See you next time.